Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I am delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar, Addressing the Engineering Talent Crisis. My name is Shelley McDonald and I'll be your host for today. Firstly, in keeping with our custom, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the countries throughout Australia and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters, skies and community. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the oldest continuous cultures on Earth and our first engineers. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past and present. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted by Engineers Australia industry partner, Brunel. Brunel is a global recruitment agency that specialises in sourcing highly technical professions across fields including engineering, project management and controls, ICT and scientific disciplines. With a strong history of supporting energy, resource, infrastructure and life science operations across the world, they have been catering to the people needs of Australian business since 1997. Brunel offer a range of employment and workforce service models spanning traditional contract, permanent and executive search through to more specialised solutions including recruitment process outsourcing, statement of work, employer of record, 482 visa on hire labour agreements and workforce mobilisation. With teams in Perth, Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney, they pair local expertise with the strength and reach of truly global network to ensure that engaging Brunel is synonymous with accessing the very highest standard of service and talent available. For today's session, we will feature a keynote speaker, followed by a panel discussion and then a live audience Q&A. And I encourage you all to send in your questions through to our speakers via the chat box. I'd now like to welcome our first guest speaker, Carita Swinnerton. As Director for ANZ at specialist recruitment agency Brunel, Carita leads the organisation's strategy, drives business growth and ensures the delivery of top-tier staffing solutions. With more than 2 decades of experience in the recruitment and employment industry, she combines deep expertise with a passion for genuine engagement to empower her teams, understand client and industry challenges, and spearheads initiatives that enable Brunel to consistently exceed expectations. Please welcome Carita Swinnerton.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for this industry webinar exploring the engineering talent crisis. It is an issue which will shape not only Australian businesses, but our country's broader workforce, productivity, and in many respects, Australia's future. To give some context, let me introduce myself. My name is Carita Swinnerton. I am the Regional Director of ANZ for Brunel, a global workforce solutions provider. My personal skill set and background is very much within the recruitment, leadership and people management space. I am not an engineer. Brunel, however, has a long-standing 50-year connection with engineers. It was founded by an engineer, began with the placement of an engineer, and to this day is very much focused on the recruitment of engineers and similar highly technical professions. But back to the topic at hand. Employers, educators and peak bodies like Engineers Australia have all recognised the progressive tightening of supply and demand within the engineering workforce for many years now. So this may sound like a stale topic at this point, but we have now passed the point of this being tomorrow's problem. The engineering talent crisis is today's reality. We are entering a decade defined by transformation. Massive defence investments, landmark infrastructure builds and the clean energy transition are all converging at once. Each of these would be a major challenge on their own, but together they've created a perfect storm. So, which industries will be in the firing line? Defence and critical infrastructure will likely experience the pain of the talent shortage as they begin ramping up their project teams. As they press harder to entice and mobilise the volume of engineers they need, that hurt will transfer to the energy and resources industries, who in turn will restock their workforce from transport and manufacturing. The more dominoes fall, the messier it will become. In some cases, projects may even end up competing against themselves. What types of engineers are going to get caught up in the talent shortage? Amongst the most identifiable are design and delivery roles in disciplines including electrical, civil, structural, mechanical, geotechnical, transport, hydraulic, power and grid connection. Biomedical and chemical disciplines are less involved, but it's hard to definitively exclude so many. So it's pretty much all of them. Is this good news for engineers? Well, yes, but maybe also no. High demand means higher wages, more opportunities, and a talent-driven market where job seekers hold most of the cards. Sounds great if you happen to be looking for a new job. But what mightn't be quite so obvious from the outset is that if employers find themselves under-resourced, the engineers they do have end up carrying the burden. Employees who are overworked and dissatisfied in their jobs won't stick around, which may just create churn, effectively reducing the engineering profession's overall capacity. The problem is that everyone is trying to fish from the same pond, and while employers can work hard to outfish one another, it may be a temporary win and won't help restock the pond. So what are we going to do about it? Organisations cannot afford to wait and see how things turn out. We need to be looking at workforce planning through a longer lens. Instead of asking, what do we need next year, we need to be talking about what the talent landscape will look like 5 years from now and what actions we can take to prepare today. That forecasting needs to be more than just about the number of active desks you have. Real thought needs to go into the internal mobility of your staff, as well as when and how they will gain the experience and skills needed to play an active role in upskilling the staff that come after them. For individual organisations, talent attraction and retention is going to be where most of this battle will play out, and it won't be solely about wages. As tempting as it is to think that higher salaries are the be-all and end-all, engineers are telling us otherwise. Yes, remuneration matters, but today's workforce is looking for something broader. Flexible work, meaningful projects, clear development pathways, and leaders who understand and support their ambitions. Employers need to work out what their unique value proposition is. That has to offer more than pay. It needs to offer a culture and environment which is genuinely desirable. From the perspective of the recruitment industry, one of the things that employers need to get better at is effectively articulating this when they come to hire. How are the projects and work your organisation offers meaningful, and will it lead to a sense of professional achievement? The question becomes, how do we compete without outspending? As a country, we must accelerate the rate at which we produce new engineers. Training more qualified engineers in Australia is the ideal way to increase the size of our workforce. But unfortunately, it is a slow fix. As it stands, engineering is a really popular career. I'm keen to hear from our panellists from ECU and Engineers Australia's policy team for their perspectives on what the education component looks like and what levers or strategies could help. While faster and smarter pathways into the profession are critical, our pipeline can include more than just graduates. We should be thinking about different ways we can re-engage semi-retired professionals who still want to contribute, and how they could play a role in giving early career talent structured support. We mightn't be able to speed up the amount of study needed to qualify as an engineer, but perhaps there are ways we can fast-track the rate at which graduates gain the experience needed for more senior positions. And perhaps most importantly, we need cross-sector collaboration. No single organisation, sector or government department can solve this alone. Universities, TAFEs, industry and government must work together to design pathways that are faster, more inclusive and aligned to national needs. Because building a pipeline is not just about filling today's jobs. It's about ensuring we have the right skills to fuel Australia's innovation and competitiveness for decades to come. International hiring will inevitably need to play a part in bridging the immediate workforce gap which we're facing. But with global recruitment comes complexity, compliance, mobility, and in some sectors, citizenship requirements. We need to navigate these challenges with agility while recognising that skilled migration is not a silver bullet. It must complement, not replace, local development. Alongside this, we must safeguard team culture. In a highly competitive market, it's easy to slip into short-term thinking. Grab the talent, fill the role, then move on. But culture is the glue that holds capability together. If we sacrifice diversity, inclusion, and collaboration in the rush to secure skills, we risk undermining long-term performance. Increasing female participation in engineering courses and professional roles is one of the greatest opportunities currently available. Engineers Australia's 2023 data identifies women as making up just 16% of the country's active engineering workforce. While female participation is growing, women made up 19.4% of engineering graduates in Australia in 2023. This was up 8.3% on the prior year. However, only 11% progressed onto engineering roles after graduation, and less than half of those workers remained in the profession 10 years later. As an industry and as employers, there's something we need to think hard on to shift this retention problem, because Australia needs all the engineers it can get. So let me leave you with this thought. Australia is on the cusp of an engineering-led decade. The projects we deliver and the talent we develop to deliver them will shape not only our industries, but our society. The question is, will we treat workforce as an afterthought, reacting when shortages hit? Or will we treat it as a strategic priority, reimagining how we attract, develop, and retain talent so that we can rise to this moment with confidence? At Brunel, we believe the answer is clear. The talent crisis is not inevitable. It is an opportunity if we act boldly, collaboratively, and with foresight. I'm looking forward to hearing the perspectives of our panel members and how we can collectively tackle the challenge that lies ahead, and how we can work together to build the engineering workforce that Australia not only needs, but deserves. I would now like to welcome our panellists for today. Jenny Mitchell. Jenny Mitchell is the General Manager, Policy and Advocacy at Engineers Australia, overseeing public policy and advocacy since July 2023. She has 20 years of policy and government experience in sectors such as space, education, science, and resources. Charles Cattermole. Charles is passionate about the clean energy transition, specialising in strategic implementation, new business models, and software solutions that enhance productivity for utility and engineering teams navigating the transition. Carl Edgar. Carl is the Talent Acquisition Lead at ASC, where he is helping to shape the workforce behind some of Australia's most strategically important naval projects. Professor Dariush Habibi. Professor Habibi is a professional engineer with 30 years of experience in both industry and academia. He is currently the head of the Centre for Green and Smart Energy Systems. He is a Fellow of Engineers Australia and a Fellow of the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology. Please welcome Jenny, Charles, Carl and Dariush. All right. So this is probably a question for you, Jenny. Where do you see the most immediate workforce pressures emerging, and which sectors do you think are likely to feel the strain first?
Thank you, Kerida. And I just want to say thanks for that wonderful keynote. That was really fascinating. And I loved your graphics there as well. A lot of fun and demonstrating exactly the challenges that people are facing. So to answer your question, first of all, I think we need to appreciate that there is that complexity of demand over the short and long term. Our group in Engineers Australia, we analyse data from government and industry. We look at their reports and their forecasting. I would say that Jobs and Skills Australia continues to report skill shortages for engineering occupations in every state and territory. But that's the short term, and I appreciate what you were saying about an engineering-led decade and that perfect storm. So what we've seen, and I encourage everyone to have a look at Engineers Australia's Engineering Tomorrow report that we published just a couple months ago, and it really reinforces what you were saying, Kerida, that there is only that one workforce. There's not separate workforces, and they are all fishing from the same pond.
And what we've got is demand in clean energy, which includes renewable projects, transmission, battery systems, and also infrastructure, which really covers housing, transport infrastructure. And then we're seeing that demand in defence as well, particularly around the AUKUS submarine program, for example. But we're also seeing growing demand in emerging sectors like in space and in that real niched advanced manufacturing. And coincidentally, just this morning, I was in a meeting where there was a discussion around the desperate need for more engineers in local government in regional areas. But I also wanted to get a bit more specific as well, if I can. So we've also recently published a report around the transferability of engineering skills into that clean energy sector. We were hearing anecdotally that you can't just pick up an engineer from oil and gas and plonk them in clean energy, and that will be a fine transition. But we were also hearing that, of course, you can pick up an engineer from oil and gas and put them in clean energy because it's the same skill set. And we wanted to get a bit more to the bottom of what was happening there. And what our research showed was that there is an absolutely transferability of technical skills. But interestingly, what employers in the clean energy sector were looking for was also those softer and, like, if you like, professional skills, such as negotiation, community engagement, project management. So they were looking for those sorts of skills in addition to the technical skills that were simply being asked of in roles in more traditional sectors. But on the flip side, and this supports what you were saying as well, Kerida, that the engineers themselves who were looking to move into clean energy were seeking those purpose-driven roles. They wanted to see how they could make a difference. And so employers, we found, could better appeal to these candidates by making that more explicit in their recruitment advertising. And finally, I just also wanted to touch on a report we published earlier this year about how engineers are using AI. So I encourage you to look at that report as well. Interestingly, it showed that AI use and AI understanding was being used less in our small and medium-sized enterprises. And so these types of businesses, which perhaps didn't have the broader infrastructure and support that the larger companies had to adopt AI, were really seeking out these skills. So just to wrap up on that answer, I encourage everyone to have a look at those 3 reports on Engineers Australia's website. The Engineering Tomorrow, which really sets out the long-term needs for Australia, the transferable skills for clean energy, and the AI use of engineers. Thanks, Kerida.
Thank you, Jenny. Look, as talent acquisition lead at ASC, this is probably a question for you, Carl. What short-term action should leaders be taking today to prepare for the next wave of demand?
Yeah, good question. I think it's very easy to kind of get stuck on kind of the long-term pipeline problems, which obviously is very real, but leaders do need to know what they can do right now, particularly given that projects are already landing on their desks. From where I sit in TA, the next wave isn't a far off event. It's already here, and it's being driven by some pretty big forces, particularly here in South Australia. For anybody who's not here, we've got some major infrastructure projects and massive defence projects that are sort of driving that next wave, being very, very almost, well, we're in it right now. So short term, I believe that leaders could be focusing on 2 kind of main areas, and the first one's really about rethinking the recruitment. I feel like a bit of a hypocrite saying this, but leaders need to streamline their hiring processes and shorten the time to hire and remove any unnecessary steps. And I say that purely because I work in a defence prime where, there are some very cumbersome and necessary steps in comparison to some of the other industries. But and that can sometimes put us at a bit of a disadvantage, especially when it comes to the very top talent that's active. But ultimately, once you've got a streamlined recruitment process, then that's going to reduce the risk of potentially losing out on talent that is moving around if you need to move quickly. The other side is the old post and pray method. It just doesn't work anymore. Yes, obviously you're seeing all of those adverts on the online job boards, but I think there needs to be a bit more creativity in finding the talent, particularly in niche areas like we have, and it is really about connecting and engaging with talent well ahead of when those needs are here. And something that us at ASC are really now starting to focus on, and building those talent pools. But it's also then about looking at the hidden talent pools. And this is my biggest point. Excuse me. We have, massive, highly skilled talent pool of overseas born engineers that are already living in Australia, who are either unemployed or they're not working in the roles in their field. And Engineers Australia, I think, has already kind of highlighted this recently. And as leaders, we need to then ask ourselves, well, are our hiring processes screening these people out? And are we unfairly demanding, the local experience for roles that don't necessarily need it? In a past role with a recruitment agency, I worked with the civil construction industry and with the mining industry, and I had clients that would tell me that they wouldn't consider candidates that hadn't worked in Australia. And we could solve a huge part of that problem by creating pathways for these qualified engineers to get their foot in the door. But that comes from those decision makers in the recruitment process to remove any kind of unfounded prejudice. But that's a cultural change. The other part is about hiring for potential and not just on experience. For some roles, especially where there's new technology or there's things like AI integration, the perfect candidate with 10 years experience is just not feasible, or that person doesn't exist. And we need to get better at identifying engineers that have got a great foundation, that meet behavioural competencies and that have a sharp, curious mind, and then have a plan to then upskill them. ASC is going through this now with a hire to develop mindset. And sometimes this is slowly adopted by some hiring managers. We get that, but we've got some hiring managers that are all for it and kind of really recruiting with that mindset that we need. The other side of the recruitment, is around the doubling down on the retention. And really it's then about, making sure that we've got, a culture where we're upskilling the current team, where we're offering an ability for them to develop and be exposed to new areas that we may need. It's about making flexibility actually means something, and that doesn't necessarily mean just working from home. I've heard some compelling discussions and points around the damage of too much working from home around collaboration and missing out on that learning via osmosis. However, flexibility for me is about autonomy. It's about trusting the senior engineers to manage their own hours, to meet deadlines, and rewarding kind of the outcome rather than whoever is in the office for the longest.
Thank you, Carl, and I certainly appreciate it that the area that you're navigating is particularly complex. But there are a few things that probably did resonate with me, and obviously Brunel as a recruitment agency, and I think it's really about the piece you talked about moving quicker. We need to be able to hire fast, and I think very much we do lose potential talent to organisations when we're not managing the candidate, as we would call it in our industries, expectations of what next steps are. So a great call out, I think, there. And the other piece that I really liked that you said was about we call it the purple squirrel, that some people don't exist. It'd be great if we could have 20 years of experience and we crossed all T's and dotted all I's. So I do think it's something that employers really need to look at is hire for potential, and the more I research that, I think that's where you're giving people a development opportunity as well. And I think it's a really great point. So thank you, Carl. Look, I'm going to throw the next one to you as well, Carl. But beyond salary, because obviously in your industry you're going to be competing with some big payers in the mining industry and some of the oil and gas, etc. So how can organisations differentiate themselves in a competitive market, and not just about, I guess, salary?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question, isn't it? ASC, we often find ourselves having to navigate this very issue. For anybody who doesn't know what we are, who we are, we're a government business enterprise, so we kind of have this commercial element to us, but under a government framework, and so we don't have the luxury of being able to compete with some of the more capitalist type organisations in aligned industries such as mining and oil and gas, where budgets maybe are a little bit bigger and there's a flexibility around being able to just offer whatever needs to be offered to get the right person in. That being said, in a market that is this tight, salaries can only be a part of the attraction strategy, and so we're hyper aware of that. Not that we don't pay above market standards. That's sometimes the issue that we have, is we have made sure that we pay above market standards, but then there are those industries that pay significantly higher again, and so we're always competing there. From what I can see every day, candidates aren't just looking though at that number. Yes, it does play a part, as you alluded to in your keynote, but candidates are also doing a total life calculation with all of this, and so I touched a little bit on the kind of working from home. They're interviewing us just as much as we're interviewing them. And my take on sort of how organizations should be thinking about it is, number one, it's about, is the work that we have career making? Engineers are bred to be problem solvers. The one thing that they can't stand is being bored or being given a sort of repetitive project. They want to be challenged. They want to work on the cool stuff. And so it's about really project diversity and the impact of the work that they're doing on a bigger scale. Is the project landmark? Is it technically complex? And that's something that ASC does have the luxury of. I'm often telling our internal recruiters, particularly when in the engineering space, when we're taking job briefs, is to spend more time on understanding the project and the purpose of that project, rather than trying to focus on the responsibilities of the requirements of the candidate. Because when we speak to the right candidate, we need to be able to sell the project to them. And we may not get a commitment from those candidates to our role, particularly if the role is not paying as much as some of the aligned industries. I touched on it earlier about having, real career developments, and that's not just necessarily climbing up a corporate ladder. One of the top reasons that engineers leave a job is because they feel like they've hit a ceiling, a development ceiling. And so that could be around offering, dual career paths. Having a technical expert pathway that is just as prestigious and just as well paid as the people management pathway. Not every brilliant principal engineer wants to be sat there managing budgets and dealing with team issues, and you can lose a lot of that really good talent because it's not the only, they don't want to get promoted to being a people manager. The other one is about really kind of investing in the upskilling, and this links back to sort of the first point I made, which was you can't just expect teams to have skills in renewable hydrogen or circular economy design, or in our case submarine hull structural design, particularly if they've not been in the naval or the shipbuilding industry before. We have to give them those skills, and that can come from developing them through external providers, or giving them the time to sort of develop with a program internally, and that shows real investment. The other part is again, I mentioned it before, around the flexibility in that work-life balance. It's probably one of the single biggest differentiators after pay. And it's not just about that policy of having 2 days work from home, because it, as I said before, I've had some really compelling arguments put to me about how too much working from home can damage collaboration, can damage culture, and that learning through osmosis. It's about trust and autonomy. It's about having an outcome mindset rather than just whoever's done the most amount of hours. And if that means that an engineer needs to go and pick up the kids and then log back on later because that's their decision, because they're focused on getting the outcome, then I think that's potentially a really big attractor for talent. And the industry is notorious for burnout. I think I'd read somewhere Professionals Australia had said that half the engineers reported that they had workplace stress and they weren't getting compensated for any overtime. And so it's really about a company that actively manages workloads and promotes the mental health and offers in their policies a way to be able to manage that. And then for me, the final one, and I'm a big believer of this, is the culture and the leadership. By being in a positive environment, I think sometimes can be a big attractor and also a big retainer. You can never put it in the contract when you're offering it to them, but people join a company, but they'll leave a manager. Randstad had said in an employer brand research that a pleasant work atmosphere was one of the top 5 drivers for talent. And I think if you stick a ping pong table in a room and think that that's you providing a place, it's not that. It's about being in a safe environment where you know that you can ask a silly question or you can challenge an idea without having a manager feeling challenged and almost attacked. It's about having that supportive leader. And so I think just to kind of wrap all that up, if you're not able to compete from a salary perspective, or if you're wanting to look at how to bring in talent outside of salary, it's about the whole package. It's showing them a clear pathway to grow. It's giving them fascinating problems to solve. It's trusting them to do their job, and it's creating a good environment for them to do all of that in.
Thanks, Carl. And so some great points there. And I think one of the things you said was about, a career development plan. It is critical for each person. But I think sometimes people think that's the career ladder, where I've heard the term reference career lattice. It doesn't necessarily have to be climbing up a ladder. You can be going, the lattice, and it can be a sideways step. So, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to throw this one to you, Charles. Have we reached the point where culture and purpose outweigh pay in attracting talent?
Thank you. And I think a lot of it builds on from what Carl was saying around organisational culture. Just from my own time in the energy sector, sort of the last 15 years, and prior to that it was defence. One thing we've noticed from a cultural side is, I have worked at the companies where they stick a ping pong table in the corner and a beer fridge and you all have fun, but that's not a replacement for culture. But one thing I have noticed is the floor's been rising over the last sort of 10 years. And what I mean by that is companies are now investing more and more into what is the culture, not just at a macro level, but at a team level. And, the comment of you don't leave the job, you leave the manager, I think stands true. And increasingly from a managerial perspective or a line manager's perspective, it's how do I maintain my team culture? How do I bring new people into the team? How do personalities work together? So it goes right back. I'm in the energy sector now, and it goes right back to that first point around, as a sector, we are now starting to value softer skills as much as technical skills, and a lot of it's due to collaboration needs. We've got massive issues around policy reform, and policy drives standards, it drives implementation, and it drives how you do the project. So to be an effective engineer, you need to be able to communicate to different stakeholders, everything from finance to lawyers to community groups and, other people on the peripheral. So technical communication is increasingly valued. And I think a lot of that also comes from culture. Do you feel safe to talk up? Do you feel safe to ask the silly question? But just building on that, purpose is the next point. And in energy, I think it was about 2016, I was trying to work it out last night, the type of candidate entering the sector changed, and a lot of it came down to people being purpose-driven. You ask people, why are you applying for the job? And it's, I want to do my part for the clean energy transition. I want to physically if you might be in the policy space, a great thing about energy projects is you can point to a wind turbine and say, I was part of the team that deployed that, I was part of the team that delivered that project. So it does make a physical and tangible outcome to what is a quite a purposeful topic for a lot of people, and we have noticed from an employment perspective it is one of the main drivers to bring people in. The challenge to that, and just on Carl's comment around project diversity, I've always been at the intersector sort of innovation and everything else. It is really hard when you've got a team of sort of 6 people, 8 people, everyone's wanting experience on the innovative project or the high profile project inside the company. I was laughing because green hydrogen was one I was on, back in 2012. But there's not enough of those projects necessarily to go around as well. So from a line manager's perspective, it's a very hard challenge to balance the development of the individual with sort of the needs of the broader team, from the perspective of maintaining the culture, maintaining the relationship, making sure everyone sort of has an opportunity as well. There's some really exciting stuff happening, but there's also a lot of mundane day-to-day stuff. And, we do appreciate people want the opportunity to grow and learn. But there is this tension inside a lot of these project teams around how do you balance that sort of opportunity to give people the experience to excel and to grow, but also, meet the day-to-day. So it is sort of a tension point, from the managerial side. But what we do find is if you can align, the team members' values, their skill sets with the project side, you do get a nice multiplier in terms of output. They're a lot happier, the team's working well, they feel personally fulfilled as well as professionally, and you can see how, the culture and purpose sort of comes together. Whether that outweighs pay or not is an interesting one. What I find or have found as a team lead is that's great for sort of 12 months, 18 months, maybe a little bit longer. But when people are, sort of 20% below industry rates within a niche because the market's moved or there's now a boom in a certain area, it's also a hygiene factor, I find. And it can be hard to have that conversation, not so much with the person, but more with the organisation. One of the jokes is, apply. The easiest way to get a pay rise is to apply for another retailer's job and then come back and ask to match the contract. But it is a little bit of a tension point at the moment, and there's something we do struggle with. Yes, culture and purpose do go a long way, but if you do want to retain someone long-term, pay is also a hygiene factor. And it is sort of finding the balance between sort of that individual as well as, what, as Carl said, what the project can afford or what the budget allows as well. But for energy overall, we are seeing purpose-driven individuals. There are a lot of ways to get involved on the purpose side outside of your day-to-day. So I'm part of the Australian Institute of Energy, and it's a great way individuals can collaborate beyond their job. And it is quite a broad church where you see people from sort of energy trading through to oil and gas, through to energy finance coming together, having that sense of purpose, having that sense of community, but also being able to, share experiences. So it's quite a interesting space.
Thank you, Charles. And I think your point on, the wave of graduates now coming through, and I guess the keenness for the clean energy transition, particularly with that youth, probably is a nice segue to my next question that I'll ask Dariush. How do we accelerate the readiness of graduates so they can contribute meaningfully sooner? Do you have any ideas on that, Dariush?
Thank you. For job readiness of the graduates, we need to foster deeper and better industry academia partnerships. And such partnerships would ensure that the curriculum that the university teaches align with the employer needs, such as emerging technologies and soft skills. I'll focus on a few key points that industry can help improve the graduate outcomes, which will ultimately benefit industry. The first point is to contribute to the design of the courses and curricula. This requires senior engineers from industry to volunteer their time for curriculum design and review and ensure that the university courses and the learning outcomes align with the current and emerging needs of industry. This is less important perhaps for engineering science units or foundational units in mathematics and physics, but very important for the applied units, which are typically taught in the third and fourth year of the Bachelor of Engineering courses. The second point is to engage with universities as industry engineers and deliver guest lectures. I know that university colleagues, academics are always very keen to have industry guest lectures to help give context for the academic content that they are teaching and talk about the applications of that content in industry. The third point is to offer more internship opportunities to engineering students. Now, industry wants more job-ready engineering graduates. They need to chip in something. You would be surprised that an increasing number of engineering students are undertaking virtual internships. Why? Because real-world internships are not available for all engineering students studying in Australian universities. And the fourth point, and this is an important one, specifically for the very niche sectors of the industry where perhaps the kind of skills they may want may not be on offer through standard university courses, is to leverage on industry alliances to sponsor the development of specialist content for developing niche knowledge and skills that are needed in specific industry sectors. So to summarize those points, I guess the job readiness of the graduates is not just up to the universities, but industry also has a key role and should invest more time and resources in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dariush. Interesting insights. Jenny, did you have any further insights in the Engineers Australia perspective on that area?
Yeah, Karina, thank you so much for throwing to me. Darush, I absolutely agree with everything you've just said. Engineers Australia has looked at that long-term need for our engineering pipeline, and we're actually advocating to government to set a target to create 60,000 more engineering graduates over the next decade. And we'd love for government to send that signal because we think that that would encourage industry, universities, and governments to work together to increase that pipeline. But when you talk about skills, I absolutely agree. Those internships or those work integrated learning experiences are critical in our engineering courses to give our students and graduates that opportunity to be exposed directly to industry. So what we're advocating for at the national level is to help both sides of the coin. So you might have seen, for instance, that the federal government announced last year that it was providing prac payments, so payments to students where they have to undertake practical internships as part of their course. Now, this was announced for nursing and healthcare and teaching students, but what we want to see is that extended to engineering students. So we've been advocating very strongly to government to consider that extension. And the flip side of that is, as Josh mentioned, helping industry to offer more of the opportunities that are needed. So the Productivity Commission, in some of its recent interim reports, have been talking about, looking at piloting tax concessions, particularly for SMEs, to deliver more workplace training to their employees. And we would like to see that kind of pilot exercise extended to support those internship opportunities for students and new graduates.
Thank you. I guess from the other end of the spectrum, we've got our graduates, but then what role do you think semi-retired professionals or career returners play in bridging current skills gap? And I'm gonna throw that question to Charles.
No, thank you. So from the energy sector perspective, if you think about the transmission network or the distribution network, a lot, even power stations, a lot of the infrastructure dates back to sort of circa 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where there was the last time there was a significant boom in the sector. And one of the issues we have is knowledge retention. So the saying is organisations have a short knowledge, but short memory. And with that comes the knowledge that sits in people's minds. It's that undocumented project. Why was this requirement set? Why is this protection system configured a certain way? Why is that cable a certain length even? It's all of those undocumented rules and requirements, and we did this for these reasons, is one of the biggest challenges we face as people do go off into retirement. And from the industry lens, there's a couple of ways people stay involved. Increasingly, we are seeing sort of specialist engineers or subject matter experts stay on as consultants or senior technical advisors, albeit in a part-time capacity. I myself was part of a mentoring program a few years ago where it was a chief operations officer, semi-retired engineer, looking at how he can impart his experience onto the next generation. There's a podcast series on at the moment as well, sort of trying to grapple with this issue. But from an industry, we're looking at it in terms of how can we also keep that knowledge? How do we keep these people, their needs as employees or contractors are changing? But we are looking at ways in which we can sort of impart that experience, or at least document it and retain it to some degree. It's a real challenge for us, and I believe a couple of other sectors face similar challenges.
Mm-hmm. Carl, is this something that you can see working in the defence industry?
Yeah, like obviously with what Charles was saying there, it's interesting because we're absolutely having the same problem, not only in our business, but I think across the industry. I don't think it's any secret that the defence industry is certainly an aging workforce, and that knowledge is soon to drop off over the next couple of years, and it's probably something that we have not addressed properly yet. I think there's pockets of areas in our business that are doing it in that same way around consultancies, but for the talent acquisition team over the next couple of years, it's going to need to be something that we really focus on, because we need to find a way of being able to get all of that excellent knowledge that we have in our workforce to then pass on to the next generation of engineers, in a very niche area of shipbuilding. So yeah, it's interesting to know that those challenges are not just within defence, that the energy sector's got them too, and hopefully there's a bit of collaboration across the industries on what's the best way to do that, best practice to get that through, that allows the aging, the people that are due to retire to still feel like they're doing meaningful work, but in a work-life balance that suits them at the tail end of their careers.
Mm-hmm. I think we've touched on graduates, and then we've also touched on, I guess, semi-retired or retired professionals. But back to you again, Carl. How realistic is it to rely on an overseas recruitment given compliance, mobility, and particularly in your area, citizenship restrictions?
Yeah, good question. It's one that ASC is dealing with constantly at the moment. But more straightforward and kind of casual answer is that relying on overseas recruitment is both 100% necessary, but it's incredibly challenging. And it's not a quick or easy fix, but it's an option that we absolutely have to keep open. Being honest about the challenging part first, it's not a silver bullet. It's definitely a marathon. It's not a sprint. The compliance and the visa process is complex. If any organizations have ever dealt with it, it takes time. The skills in demand visa system is intended to kind of streamline things, but there's still significant amounts of paperwork, depending on the country that the preferred candidate comes from. There's labour market testing that has to happen, which can take 4 weeks alone. The cost involved for every single candidate that comes over potentially with their families, if they've got families that's coming over too. We can't fill a role that's open today with an overseas candidate tomorrow. It's a 6 to 12 month scenario at best, and certainly we're going through some of that with some of our niche roles now that are probably reaching that 12-month mark, and they've not started yet. And on top of that as well, there's a global talent situation. I don't want to use the word kind of war, but there's a battle for top talent globally now. We're not the only country that's looking for top engineers. We're in direct competition with countries like the UK and the US and even Canada and some of the other countries as well. And they're often fishing for the same talent pools, but sometimes with much, much simpler pathways to Australia. And then, there's the onshore talent pool. And this is, I guess, the key point that Engineers Australia is raising, is that we have this massive, highly skilled pool of overseas qualified engineers that are already living in Australia, who have either, like I say, they're not working, or they're working in roles that's below their qualifications. And as I mentioned before, leaders need to take responsibility to look at this onshore talent pool first and ask, why are the processes screening those people out? But having said all of that, there's certain highly specialized skills for us. Overseas recruitment isn't just realistic, it's the only option, and so the best example for that for us is it's the AUKUS program that we're working on. We're being asked to help provide a workforce capability so that we can build and sustain nuclear powered submarines in Australia, which, as you know, does not have a domestic nuclear industry. We simply just don't have a workforce with 10 to 20 years of experience in this space. And this is where, we need to find those nuclear suitably qualified and experienced people. We've got to go overseas. We rely entirely on those particular roles from our AUKUS partners like the UK and the US to bring the foundational senior talent in. But the plan for us isn't to just hire them and that's it. The plan for us, or the strategy for us, is that those people, those kind of first people through the door, then train and mentor the next generation of our own Australian workforce. So they are the seed for building our sovereign capability. So I guess, is it quick? Is it easy for our general engineering shortages? No. It's slow, it's expensive, and it should always be paired with a much stronger strategy to upskill and recognise the local onshore talent that we already have. But is it realistic and necessary for our national priorities? Absolutely. For game-changing programs such as the AUKUS program, like targeted overseas recruitment, is part of our strategy in order to get this off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Carl. And I imagine in the clean energy transition as well, Charles, you're going to have similar kind of challenges in a reliance on overseas kind of experience, albeit it may not be the citizenship requirements. How do you see it as being a realistic kind of, I guess, strategy?
It's sort of a double-edged sword. Just to mirror a lot of Carl's comments, it's really interesting in that, on one hand, if you've done stuff like grid protection studies, power system and controls, transmission, that's all directly transferable, and I do think the industry does acknowledge that. Where it gets complex is less so around the standards, but more how the standards and requirements map back to the local industry. So what makes a great engineer in the energy sector? Yes, we were talking about the softer skills before, but the other thing is the understanding of the layering around how standards get driven by rules, regulations, and more importantly, sort of policy. And that policy comes from community expectations more holistically. So there's a great example. There's international standard. What was it? 2030 IEEE 2030.5, which is like the smart inverter protocol. That's been adapted from an international standard. It goes into the California smart inverter protocol, and then we have CSIP-OZ, it's called for Australia. It's a really nuanced standard, but we've created our own sort of quagmire of implementation around it. And where it gets even more complex is the implementation of that standard or the application changes on a state-by-state basis. So this sort of comes back to, yes, engineers are great at, standards requirements, operating within frameworks to solve problems, but more holistically, if someone's coming into Australia, you do need to understand the policy, the legislation, and how the legislation drives the practical application of, the standards and requirements you'd be looking at. So from an engineering standpoint, we do like engineers coming out of the UK. From a regulatory aspect, it's very similar. Germany's the same. The US is quite interesting. So people who have worked in Texas, so the ERCOT market, that's a very similar regulatory structure to the eastern states in Australia. So what we sort of find internationally is, can the person apply their skills to the local market? Do they understand the local context? Linking back to the start, you lift and shift an engineer from oil and gas into energy, and they're not useful for 6 months. And a lot of that is the contextual understanding rather than the practical understanding, and it does take time. And organisations can invest in training, development, and stuff like that. But what we find time and time again is, until someone works through the problems or even realises, what the problem is, it's actually quite hard to onboard someone straight away.
Mm-hmm. On the back of Charles's comments, I'd love to hear your views, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks, Kerida. What I thought I might do that I think will support the sorts of things that Carl and Charles were saying is actually provide some data. So in the last few weeks, actually, Engineers Australia has released some new data and analysis that looks at this migrant engineer population. So to give you some context, we know that our migrants overall are more highly educated than the Australian population. So we see 53% of migrants holding a bachelor degree or higher, whereas compared to the Australian population, we see that at around 32% holding a bachelor degree or higher. Then we look at just how reliant we are on overseas-born engineers in Australia, and it's 62% of the current engineering workforce are overseas-born. Now, because of the limitations of data, that doesn't mean they're all migrant engineers who have come as adults into Australia. That would include engineers who were born overseas but perhaps went through schooling or university or their early career here in Australia as well. But just with that caveat, and also interesting point in the data is that of our female engineers, 74% of them were born overseas. So we know that takes us right back to consider where that pipeline coming through primary school, secondary school, and university here for female engineers is really lacking. But importantly, and this was the headline from the data that we put out, is that we did see this continued underutilisation of migrant engineers. And this is what Carl and Charles were saying about engineers working below their skill level or their experience level, or just working in other sectors entirely and not necessarily in engineering related roles. And we saw that if we were able as a country to better utilise 80,000 migrant engineers of that cohort, by 2030, we could see a $2.6 billion increase in GDP, which is massive, and just would be a massive boon to the nation, not just in GDP, but in terms of productivity for certain companies, certain projects, and there's immense value to be had there. One other thing I did want to put out, and this is something that we're also advocating to governments for, is that where we look at Australia as a destination for that global talent, Carl's exactly right that we're seeing this increasing global competition for engineering talent. And that doesn't just mean that countries are making themselves a more attractive destination to grab that global talent. It also means they're making themselves a more attractive destination to retain their own domestic talent. And that's where we think we need to be doing both pieces of that pie. Thanks, Karen.
No, thank you. And I think I'll finish off just with one last question, also directed at you, Jenny. But what do you think is the right balance of responsibility between government, education, and industry in solving this challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, Darush put it out there as well. It has to be all those parts of the system working together. And as engineers appreciate, system management is critical, and it's important to have the system working. Where we see that government can have a real role is setting those signals, setting the right conditions for everything to operate better. So I will, if you don't mind, Kara, to just talk a bit more about where Engineers Australia is advocating to government, particularly at the federal, national level, around improving that engineering pipeline and strengthening that workforce, because we do see Australia's engineering capability as being critical to all of the national priorities that we have, and particularly those sectors like clean energy, infrastructure, and defence. So I already mentioned that we're advocating for 60,000 additional graduates. And as I said, that is acknowledging that we will need to strengthen our domestic pipeline as other countries initiate activities to better retain their own. But we're also asking, and we've been calling this, the shorthand is an engineering surge. So that's where we want government to really signal that engineering capability is critical, and we need to look at how we strengthen that pipeline all the way from STEM, so the early childhood interest in STEM and inspiring little kids to get into engineering, through school where we want to see more kids doing advanced maths, for example, through to how we better retain people in our university courses, because we know that it's a tough degree. We need those workplace internships, those experiences, and then all the way through to what we were just talking about then in terms of the challenges of attracting global talent, of better utilising the global talent we already have here in country, and bringing more diversity into the workplace. So that's what we really, that's our kind of big ask of government, to set that signal. Then we've got some other things. We would really like to see engineering boosted in the government sector itself. So in the public sector, I can't tell you how many engineers I talk to in industry who are applying for tenders, they're working with government agencies on projects, but what they're dealing with is not technical experts. And that can have real challenges in how projects are designed, in how procurements are rolled out. So we really want to see government itself strengthen its own engineering capability to inform decision makers really when there's those technical requirements. And, we would love to see that led by a chief engineer at the national level. And finally, the government did last year undertake a huge review and develop a huge report around diversity in STEM. And what we really want to see government do is respond to that report and implement its findings. And that diversity is broad. So it's not just women in engineering, but it is about our wonderful migrant engineers. It's about our engineers who are underrepresented in other ways and how we support them, not just to be attracted to the profession, but how we retain them in the profession as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. Look, that ends my input for now, but I'd like to hand over to Shelley for the live Q&A.
Hi, everyone. I was just reflecting then on all the concepts, all the challenges that have been discussed through the panel, and also through Garita's keynote. And the two words skill shortage seem quite simple and clear, but then when you unpack the complexities of the engineering pipeline and the current and future challenges, it's not as simple as it seems. So we're heading into Q&A now. Please, as I start going through some of the questions, keep your questions coming through the live chat, and we'll read through them. And if you would like it directed to a particular member of the panel, please make sure you put their name there. So I might just kick it off. We've had quite a bit of discussion around our overseas qualified engineers, so I might just start there as we look at the different cohorts. And Carl, there's a question here that's been put through the live chat around how many engineering professions with work visas find it difficult to get into the industry, and you touched on some of the requirements for defence projects, obviously, so it can depend on the industry they're going into. But how do you think you can address this issue with the shortage by tapping into that international talent more?
Say that question again, sorry.
Sorry, so the question is, many engineering professionals with work visas find it difficult to get into the industry, even though they're well qualified. So how would you address this issue with talent shortage?
And not knowing the individual kind of circumstance of that person and what they've necessarily gone through, it's hard to necessarily answer what that person's sort of done so far. I would say that when somebody is qualified and has got the qualifications and they've potentially got themselves registered, there could be a couple of things at play, and obviously there's that, as we've talked about before, there's the prejudice from the hiring managers that there's maybe standards are different overseas, and obviously if you've got some sort of a register, if you're registered with sort of one of the governing bodies, well then that kind of should alleviate that concern from the hiring manager. But unfortunately, that's a cultural change that has to happen there. The other part is that interviewing for a role is not a simple case of a hiring manager speaking to somebody and saying, oh, well, they're qualified, then let's hire them. There's so many other factors that come into a hiring manager being comfortable with taking a person on. Often there's behavioral competencies that support a qualified engineer coming in. So we have had a number of occasions where we've had highly qualified engineers interview for a role and they've not been successful because of other factors around behavioral competencies or anything like that. And so what I would say is that, like I would advise to anybody, whether they're an overseas qualified candidate or whether they are a qualified candidate here from Australia that's not being successful, is have a look at getting feedback from the people that you're interviewing with. Really try to break down, and that sometimes is not easy for a hiring manager or a recruiter to give that kind of feedback. They often don't want to hurt somebody's feelings by telling them. So this was our concern. It sometimes feels quite pointed, but I would encourage to get feedback as to what is missing, so that you then know what you can potentially upskill. Because it may be that your interview technique is not getting across your ability to do this role. It could be that the way in which you've communicated your experience is not putting that across. So there could be that. Sometimes it's a case of maybe putting yourself forward for some short-term assignments to get over the potential worry of that local experience, whether it's right or wrong, for the hiring managers to have those preconceptions. I think sometimes just getting your foot through the door on some short-term assignments can work. And so working with recruitment agencies such as Brunel and similar types can also assist to just get your foot through the door. There's so many varying factors as to why somebody may not be successful for a role. It may not be just as clear as that someone's not taking you on purely because you're from overseas. And so I would always look at those options too.
Thanks, Carl. Some great insights there and practice on how to navigate. And it is challenging when you apply for multiple positions and you're not successful, but getting that feedback can hopefully put foot forward for your next application.
Just whilst I'm talking that, I've just had another think as well, is some of the times that we've also looked at applications, and it's almost that there's maybe the job that they have applied for may not be the most suitable role. And we have seen a number of occasions, and again, this is not pointed at the person who asked the question, this is not me speaking generally, is that we've had people who have, you can clearly see they have blanket applied for any role in whether that be in a panic to get a job or not. It's really important to be really targeted with the roles that you're applying for, because when you start to sort of scattergun your applications, it can really damage the strength of your application in the market, or at least your reputation in the market, your brand in the market. So yeah, that's probably another thing as well, is to really make sure that you're tailoring which roles you're applying for, as opposed to applying for everything you possibly can. So that's just about.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think through the panel discussion, we saw so many different industries for niche skills or specific skills. So sending those generic applications, you're probably not giving yourself the employer the best picture of your skills if it's not tailored for that specific role. So on that point, there's another question for you, Charles, that's come through from Omar from Victoria, and we'll switch from migrant engineers to graduates. So the question is, how can graduates best address breaking into a difficult field? So energy being quite a specialised field and growing, what's your advice for graduates?
Get out and meet people, learn the industry, learn the people. So as I said, I'm a member of the Institute of Energy. We actually have a program called Young Energy Professionals, and it's targeting graduates or sort of, the under 30 cohort. And they do everything from like networking nights through to, trivia, through to, panel sessions with, various talkers going through different topics. I'd say, look at the industry you want to get into, make sure it's for the right reasons, but also look at the different, not just Engineers Australia, but, the different communities within that industry, and go out, get involved, meet people, talk to people. It's one of the easiest ways. Just on, some of what Carl was saying, it's a great way to know who's hiring, what skills do they really need, who's got grad positions, who doesn't. Someone, I talk to grads all the time at, these networking nights and other events, and it's always, look at these 3 companies, they have really great grad programs, or go talk to this manager, they need someone like yourself. So it's, not only is it looking at who's hiring on, sort of the more formal search platforms, but also that softer set of, networking, leveraging the network, finding out what people need, learning what you can about the industry, genuinely coming up and asking people questions. We're all friendly people, and, as we all know, most networking nights, there's a few drinks there, and everyone's happy to have a chat. But my sort of comment is get involved with the industry, meet people, talk to people, be curious, be polite, and you'll find a lot comes out of it. And even just being able to understand conceptually, what are the pain points, what are the topical areas, what are the main projects, or who's working on what is that goes a long way into helping someone at an interview session, or when they do start going through a formal application process.
Great, some great tips there, Charles. And talking about networking and professional associations, Jenny, wondering if you want to add anything to that question to support graduates, but more broadly, people trying to crack into the sector.
Thanks, Shelley. Yeah, Charles, I think you're spot on. And I just wanted to, give a plug for Engineers Australia events, which obviously you've all navigated if you've come to our webinar. But I also wanted to just reinforce how beneficial and great our face-to-face events are, and those are in every state and territory. So please find your local face-to-face events, come do that networking, do those chats, and really, even if it's not about a particular job, I've definitely seen lots of our members, find mentors that way. That has really set them up not just for the next career step, but really navigating the whole sector and navigating their careers and the moves that they'll have from years on. So I encourage graduates and our overseas qualified engineers to get involved in those events as well.
Jenny, Darius, just wondering from your work with cities, if you've got advice for graduates, and as Jenny mentioned, our overseas qualified engineers based on the last couple of questions.
Sure. Look, with the work that I'm doing at the university, we have a lot of international qualified engineers who come and talk to us. They ask whether it is essential for them to get an Australian qualification in order to secure a position in the workforce. And occasionally I have time and I volunteer to look at their CV or to look at their cover letter. And I think the gap is not necessarily in their skill set. The gap is that they don't understand the local context. They don't understand the local culture and expectations. And I'll give you, for instance, one example of an engineer who came to me. He was an electrical engineer with 3 years experience overseas. And I looked at his CV and he had written about 6 or 7 pages, which is quite often the case when you are looking at engineers from Asia, South Asia, sometimes Middle East. For a limited number of years of work in industry, they have way too many pages on their CV. So that is the very first point, that they need to learn how to be very concise and picky about the information that they are putting in the CV. Same goes with the cover letter. And I guess, was it Charles or Carl that mentioned that they apply basically for any job without considering whether it actually suits their background or not. And I guess this is an area that EA perhaps can be more active and organize more induction session for engineers who are migrants, who have come here on a work visa or on a full residency visa, and run those sessions by volunteers. And I know that I have done quite a bit of it myself one-to-one, but if it is a group session, it just makes it easier, so that you can put those points across about how to write a cover letter, how to write a good CV, how to not over exaggerate your areas of skills and expertise, and how to sit in an interview. All of those are, I guess, local and cultural intricacies that many migrant engineers wouldn't know until they have lived here for a number of years. And we obviously don't want them to be out of the workforce for those years. Thank you.
Thank you, Darius. And just another, I guess, shameless plug for EA. At an EA event, we do our Overseas Qualified Engineer Career Support Hub, where we have a lot of those resources that you've just talked about, and they were developed with our members. So we've got downloadable documents, training videos that are developed by engineers, so for engineers. And I think some of the networking opportunities, understanding the market that everyone's talked about are just the keys. So I might just change tack a little bit, keeping an eye on time. And Garita, there's a deliberate question here for you that talking about diversity, how do we get young school-age females interested in engineering as a profession?
Look, that's a great question, and I think it's one that we need to keep asking ourselves. I believe a big part of the challenge lies in the narrative we're still unconsciously telling our kids. I have primary age children myself, and I was genuinely taken aback just a couple of years ago when a school email asked for dad volunteers to help with flat packs. Look, there was no intent behind it, but it did make me pause and reflect and go, okay, well, what other subtle messages are we sending about gender norms and roles to our young people? I think to shift the dial, we need to start talking to girls earlier about careers that are considered non-traditional pathways. At a young age, kids generally understand, what a nurse or a doctor does, but how do we bring the story of an engineer to life in a way that's relatable and inspiring to our kids and to our girls? At Brunel, we sponsor Fairholme College and all-girls school in Toowoomba in the Hydrogen Grand Prix. I think it's initiatives like this that I think all schools and corporates should support to promote STEM and engineering, particularly within the female cohort. I think these kinds of programs help make engineering tangible and exciting, and they need to start early. So while we support Fairholme College, it'd be great if we could start to support, primary school or even younger kids in that pathway before, I guess, career choices are already formally being made, which is at a crazy young age in high school these days. So I think ultimately it's about changing perceptions, creating visibility, and I guess sparking curiosity in our female students. And I think that starts with the stories we tell them, and it starts with the opportunities we create for females and girls.
Yeah, great insight. It really is about you can't be what you can't see, and showing those opportunities at a young age and building that awareness for not just young women, but young well, just if they want to be a problem solver and an innovator, engineering's potentially a good pathway for them. Charles, I have a question for you. Question from Dale in Queensland. How can new technologies, AI chatbots and AI agents, be used to increase productivity and reduce the burden on the pool by allowing people to focus on value add? That's quite a long question, so feel free to break it up into different components.
No, thank you. It's actually very topical because this is exactly what I'm working on at the moment. One of the several things, like most engineers, we do, don't sleep at night and have several projects on the go. But what we've sort of come to realise from an industry perspective, and I think it was Deloitte was in the news recently on this, in that a graduate plus AI doesn't necessarily deliver the promises you think. The graduate doesn't have the experience to know when to challenge the AI, when is it hallucinating, when has it gone off on a tangent that's not relevant to the context of the problem. But the flip side is if you give AI to a seasoned professional, like a principal engineer, you actually get a multiplier. It's about, anecdotally a 10 times multiplier in output. So it's this really interesting sort of dilemma where AI is a massive enabler in the right hands. It's a very powerful tool, but also in the wrong hands, it's also quite dangerous. So from my perspective, what we're sort of looking at is a narrow AI application. So going back, essentially to its genesis around machine learning models and very targeted sort of data sets and, model applications, rather than looking at general purpose AI, which, ChatGPT, you can ask it everything around why is my dog sick through to what are the main drivers of the energy transition, but it doesn't necessarily give you that depth required to take it to a level needed to answer, technically detailed questions. And then the other issue is around, from a business perspective, how do you overlay constraints? How do you overlay controls? How do you overlay governance? And sort of what we've found is narrow AI applications coupled with workflow management are able to sort of accelerate productivity. Some of the pilots we've done, the feedback's been it gives clarity and focus. I know where to focus my time. I can get the unimportant updates out the door pretty quickly. And then I can actually spend my time analysing what really matters. And then if you think about it more holistically from a process flow perspective, it's sort of the classic bottleneck dilemma. In an organisation, we can all think of them. You've got an engineer in the back corner managing something out of a spreadsheet, but that engineer is the final approver or signing authority on a deployment, on a product, on a project. Classic problem solving tells us we need, if that engineer's overworked and, drowning in what they need to do, normally you'd go out and find a second one and, have two engineers there, you get a bit of redundancy. But as everyone said today, it's actually hard to find people, particularly with narrow and niche experience, applied to the right context. So what we've found with AI coupled with workflow management is, before information gets to the signing authority or the approving engineer, you can actually start bringing some of that expertise and requirements and constraints into the workflow upstream. So by the time it goes through your QA and review processes, the caliber of what goes through is at a much greater level, and it's at a much greater standard. So I think sort of personally, AI is going to fundamentally change engineering and knowledge work. Engineering is quite unique in that there's a legal component to it. And what I mean by that is, if you sign off on something as a professional engineer through, Engineers Australia for a plug, but if you sign off on something as an engineer, you're actually saying, this piece of work is compliant to the relevant standards. I have done my due diligence in terms of, checking the risks, checking the impact. To the best of my knowledge, this thing is, safe for people to use. The bridge isn't going to fall down, to use that analogy. So there's always going to be a role for engineering, but what we're seeing is how work gets to the engineer is starting to change. And one of the concerns, more coming out of software than engineering, is developers are now coming through using sort of AI as a co-pilot. Pair programmer is probably a better word, but a software developer plus AI is great, but they don't get the same experience. They don't get the same learnings. They don't get the same insights from stewing on a problem for a couple of weeks and then, having that moment of clarity on the way into work one morning. So it is starting to change some of the experience and skills you see come through. But what we've found from applying it in organisations is you can't just let AI run loose. You can't take someone who doesn't understand the context or the depth of the domain and just assume they'll be fine with AI. AI at its core is a predictive language model, so it's trying to guess what you want based on the prompt, and prompt engineering can go a long way, but it doesn't actually solve the constraint problem. So I do hope that answers the question, but just personally, it's people, process, governance, and we can't forget the other two.
No, thanks for that information. It's so complex, the world of AI, and I think we're still all grappling about how it can improve efficiencies, how it can support recruitment and technologies, but then also what are some of the pitfalls when, particularly in engineering, we're surrounded by national standards and regulations, and where it best fits. Did any of the other panel have a comment around AI, since it is quite topical and the influence it's having across the sector? Dariush, I'm just interested in your thoughts on how AI is influencing, not just new graduates and students, but even some of ours that are coming back to further their career through academia.
Well, look, AI is a useful tool if one knows how to use it. And I guess my colleagues on the panel have already highlighted that if somebody is already knowledgeable, then they can use AI as a side tool to fast track the task and achieve the outcome faster. But AI at the hand of a novice or a fresh engineer or a university student is a very dangerous tool, because they cannot query the answer, they cannot gauge the quality, and they can consider that this is what needs to happen, or this is the solution that I need to offer. Within the university, it is a dilemma as well, because AI is something that, when it comes to assignments, assessments, the ones that are not invigilated, it is relatively hard to establish that somebody has used AI. I mean, sometimes you can detect it because the pattern doesn't match their regular writing. But it is very important to basically induct the graduate engineers, and in our case, the university students, into responsible and effective use of AI, because otherwise it can be, as I mentioned, quite a dangerous tool.
Yeah, I have to agree.
Yeah, thank
Obviously,
you.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, with not having an engineering background myself, but from a recruitment perspective, there's a double-edged sword with AI that allows, as you've just said, a novice to create the illusion that they are highly skilled and highly knowledgeable, and so there's a fear that someone can be employed or be put in a position that is above their capabilities because AI has allowed them to create the illusion of being an expert in a particular area. And so, if that person doesn't have integrity when it then comes to a very critical decision being made, or when they're then left alone because the belief is that they can be left to be autonomous to do something, and that can become very, very dangerous and difficult. And from a recruitment perspective, we do see AI as a way of helping us, but there is some fear that people will just completely rely on it. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think someone mentioned earlier that when you are recruiting, it's not always about the technicals, it's also about how that person has experienced a project or how they're going to fit with the team and the actions, and sometimes that distorts some of that. I have a question that I'd like to put to all of you, if we could do just a quick whip around that's come through from Karen. What do you think are the key capabilities we need to be building in our future talent? So, Garita, I might start with you because you're on the top of my screen for your expertise in recruitment. What do you think we need the future of Australian engineering talent?
It's do you know what, my answer is actually not just across engineering. I think it goes across a number of professions and what we look at, when we're getting grads of any kind. But I think it's back to the basics. I think it's back to, are they being curious? But I also think it's looking at people's soft skills, their tenacity, their stickability. And I think there's probably some of the skills that, when we are looking at those entry level roles, when we do recruit those roles, that we're probably missing. So I would probably say it's not unique to engineering, it's across the board, but just that hustle and that drive.
Great. Charles, your insights?
I'd agree. We've recently started building a new team, and every single person of that team we hired not because of their technical competence. They are highly competent, and I know a few of them are watching now and probably laughing. But every one of them was selected because of that tenacity, that interest, that curiosity, the ability to break something down into first principles and work through a problem. So we actually went out of our way to find people sort of left of field, who were, academically, they more than ticked the box, but, coming into the interviews and just coming to Carl's point, we opened every interview with a curveball question to throw anyone off who sort of was sitting there with a script or, a work through A, B, C, and D. It was more, tell us about yourself, show us some side projects, what do you do, for fun? Show us projects you've worked on in your own time. And we've seen some really, really interesting stuff, and the guys have great portfolios, but none of it had to do with what they did at university. It was all, their own personal interest, and we found that personal interest drives, why they want to be in the role, what they want to do, and how successful they have been.
Yeah, fantastic. Carl?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with both Charles and Karita there. I think that the answer to your question does stretch further than engineers. For me, it's critical thinking. It's an ability to show vulnerability and be able to, say that you don't know a particular thing and be comfortable in that, because that allows you to then learn and develop. Good communication, care factor, all of these things are not, taught in a formal capacity. These are things that are behavioral, and often what you find is that when you're we're interviewing people, or when we're screening people for a role, that's the stuff that we can add value to when we're putting forward to our hiring managers, is the behavioural competencies of a person. And so when you say what capabilities are missing or what are needed, I think that's what people need to potentially focus on. It's all well and good having the qualification or the degree or the ticket or license, but it's the human personal element that really secures you as a valuable employee of a business. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Carl. Dariush, do you have some inputs on that one to share?
Yeah, I guess I can talk from the perspective of an educational institution. I'm a believer of giving a student in any discipline first a very broad foundation before diving them into the specialist area. And over the last, I would say, 30 years or so, and I can certainly say about engineering courses, they have become narrower and narrower and more specialist. And the disadvantage is that you are educating engineers who have little knowledge of the allied fields, who have little knowledge of other disciplines of engineering. And when they hit the workforce, they are in a team working with electrical, mechanical, civil, chemical engineer, and so forth. And they have had little exposure to those areas. So to my university colleagues, if any of them are here, do not push the niche of specialization too far. Ensure that they have a broad understanding of engineering across the disciplines and then learning the specialist area of knowledge. Such engineers are going to be more adaptable technically. Obviously, other panel members spoke about the soft skills and teamwork and so forth. But on the technical side, somebody with a broader grounding in engineering sciences will be more adaptable within the job market, and they can maneuver their area of knowledge and skill easier than someone who has been through a very narrow and highly specialist engineering degree. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny?
Thanks, Shelley. Just finally, I guess I would just draw on that topic of collaboration. So being able to collaborate with your peers, but also with your clients, with the end users, with those policymakers that are setting the rules and standards, and of course with the public. I'd encourage everyone to be an advocate for the engineering profession. Be confident in telling the stories about how engineering impacts people's lives and how it contributes to solving the problems that we all have. And if you are talking to young people or kids, just sharing stories about what engineers do to hopefully inspire some of the next generation as well. Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for everyone that stayed online. We've run a little bit over times, but I want to thank you for all the time you spent with us today. And please join me once again for thanking our panelists, our keynote speaker, Garita Swinnerton from Brunel, Jenny Mitchell from Engineers Australia, Charles Catamol, Carl Edgar, and Professor Dariush Habibi for their time and valuable input. I'd also like, on behalf of engineers, to thank Brunel for their support, and also wanted to take the opportunity for the HR professionals that might be online watching today's webinar to let you know that we have our HR forums happening across the country in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in November. And we look forward to seeing you at those events. And finally, we would really appreciate if you could take a moment to complete the short feedback form linked in the description box below. Your input is really valuable for us to plan future sessions. But in closing, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Industry Partners event.